Recently, I made a video about how I mix ECN2 developer from scratch for under 50 cents a roll, and I got tons of comments asking if there was a way to do the same thing for C-41. The only problem is that while C-41 is much more common, there's no published recipe from Kodak for that developer like there is with ECN2. It's proprietary. And all the community formulas online for mixing it from scratch seem legit, but they're hard for me to trust. They're based on old forum recipes, various patents and data sheets, and other people's reverse engineering. So for my own home C-41, the past couple years I've just bought these huge 25-liter developer replenisher kits directly from Kodak, which are enough for at least 100 rolls. The kit comes as these 3 concentrates, which you mix up with water to make working developer. At first, I mixed it all up at once and stored all 25 liters in a bunch of sealed wine bags, but that went bad way too quickly. After that, I started storing just the concentrates in their own wine bags and mixing them with water on demand. That worked way better, but I still didn't fully trust how long they'd stay usable. Eventually, I started taking all my important rolls to the lab again, which kind of defeated the whole purpose of having all these chemicals in the first place. But a couple months ago, I realized only one of the concentrates is actually supposed to go bad. So what if I could reverse engineer that part well enough to stop relying on it altogether? Could I mix the other parts whenever I wanted and just add back the important chemicals myself? Could this solve the C-41 storage problem? Could I make my developer last potentially years? Could I play God? Let's find out. So in order to make home C-41 make sense for me, it needs to be both cheap and trustworthy. It doesn't really matter how cheap we make things if we don't even trust the developer after a couple months. And if it's not cheap, I might as well just go to the lab. The lab to me is the gold standard. I really can trust it for great results, but it's expensive and can be inconvenient just physically having to go there. Smaller C-41 kits are more convenient, but they really only win on cost when reused. And every time you reuse the developer, it gets a little bit worse. That's why I like to use my developer one shot. Mixing everything from scratch would be best, but like I said, I just don't trust the info online enough for that. And then there's the bulk option from Kodak. A while back, I emailed the guy on its datasheet, and he confirmed that even though it's sold as developer replenisher, it's the exact same stuff as what's in the consumer kits. The only issue is that Kodak says it just lasts 12 weeks once you open it. If you can manage to use it all, it's well under $1 per roll. So the real question is, how can we make it last as long as possible? First, you should understand what's actually in each of the concentrates, so you'll follow the logic of what I did. As I mentioned before, Kodak's standard C-41 developer here is made up of 3 concentrates that you mix together with water. Part A is the alkaline backbone. It pushes the pH high enough for the developer to actually work, holds it there, and locks in the right amount of activity we want. Part B is the preservative. It's what keeps the developer from going bad once mixed. And Part C is what actually develops your film. It's got the color developing chemical itself, called CD4 or color developer 4, plus a bit of sulfite. The interesting part is that parts A and B are actually pretty shelf stable. Part C is the only one that actually goes bad in any reasonable amount of time, since CD4 sitting in solution can oxidize pretty quick if it's exposed to any air. So that got me thinking, dry CD4 powder is supposed to be shelf stable for years. What if I mix my own good enough approximation of part C with some of that? How closely could I match my standard home process, or the lab too for that matter, with this hybrid approach? I had a roll of Kodak Gold in my freezer that would be perfect for this. I loaded it in my Nikon 8008S, or as I lovingly refer to it, the boobs camera, since I trust its shutter the most out of all my 35mm cameras. My idea was to bracket a controlled test scene over the whole roll, which I'd then split into a few different test strips. I set up this little still life as my test scene. I tried to have as much color as possible with a decently wide dynamic range. I bracketed -1, box speed, and +1 repeatedly over the whole roll, all just by changing the shutter speed. I figured if I was cutting the film in the dark, I could guarantee I'd have at least one full bracketed set for each test if I cut it into 4 strips. Strip 1 I'd have developed at the lab. This would be my external reference. Strip 2 I developed normally with the full Kodak kit I had at home, using parts A, B, and C. And I'd had these sitting in wine bags for around 7 or 8 months at this point, so I'd also get to see how much things had degraded in that amount of time. We'll call this the stock strip. For 250 milliliters of stock developer, this is how much I measured for each part. After mixing all this up, I ran it at 100 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 minutes and 15 seconds, just as the C-41 spec calls for. Strip 3 would be the actual test. The same amount of parts A and B like before, but with 9.5 milliliters of part C replaced with 9.5 milliliters of water and 1.13 grams of this CD4 powder, which I'd ordered from Artcraft Chemicals. This is the hybrid strip. And since I had one extra strip to work with, I decided I'd have a little fun. I wanted to see what would happen if I reused the ECN2 recipe, just replacing the 1 gram of CD3 it calls for with the same 1.13 grams of CD4. I think it fits to call this the cursed strip. The results I got were pretty interesting and kind of disappointing, to be honest. I did get images on all 4 strips, but it really surprised me how different they all were. I decided to put them all side by side on the same light table. Inverting everything individually can make it hard to see what's really going on. So what I did here was crop in on just the box speed lab frame, run Negative Lab Pro on that, and then zoom back out. Starting with the lab strip, it looks, well, like normal lab-developed Kodak Gold. Not too much to say here. Things get a bit more interesting with the fully stock home strip. If we compare how bright the whites of the wall are, it seems like my old chemistry was actually more active than the lab's. It kind of looks like it was pushed maybe a half stop or so. And besides that, the colors look similar enough. The reds seem like they lost a bit of saturation, but I'd say it's a pretty respectable showing from chemistry I'd had in wine bags for 8 months. Moving to the hybrid strip now, we can see something is clearly not right. I did get a nice, dense, scannable image, but the colors are just off. All the reds turned completely orange, and maybe due to that, the scene shifted noticeably cooler. And I might be imagining it, but this strip could even be a bit denser than the stock strip, although they are pretty close. That tells me the dose of CD4 was probably at least in the right ballpark. And finally, that brings us to the cursed strip. I have to admit, this result gave me even more questions than I started with. It basically looks like what would happen if you took the hybrid strip and played around with the white balance sliders. It still got the same intensely orange shifted reds, and I had no idea why. If we invert the box speed shots individually, that helps us factor out any differences with white balance and get a more realistic showing from each strip. As you can see, the differences between lab and stock are pretty minor, and hybrid and cursed are surprisingly close to each other as well. So yeah, after all this work, I was hoping I'd be able to declare victory and say, see, I solved C-41 storage. But that obviously was not going to be the case, at least not at this point. Theoretically, the logic of what I was trying to do should have been sound, but something was screwing up my results. So I decided to run one more round of tests and do things properly this time. Luckily, I at least knew where I wanted to start. C-41 Developer is supposed to run at a pH of 10, plus or minus 0.05. But when I'd measured the stock developer, it was a little high at 10.11. Not too bad though. The hybrid developer I'd noticed was even higher, coming in around 10.26. And cursed was the furthest off of all, at 10.32. And I'd measured all of this with my fancy brand new calibrated pH meter, so I was pretty sure I could trust these measurements. That made the next thing I wanted to test clear. If I could bring the pH back down to spec, maybe the reds would stop turning so orange. I wasn't sure though, so I decided to give myself some insurance. This time I bought 3 fresh rolls of gold, and used those to make a ton more match test strips. After setting up my test scene as close to before as I could get it, I bracketed -2 through +2, so 5 shots per strip. After that, I put the camera in bulb mode, took off the lens, and physically reached through the lens mount to put a little piece of tape on the film itself. That way, I could feel exactly where I'd need to cut the film in the dark. This would let me avoid wasting duplicate shots on each strip like before. This was fresh film, so first I needed a new baseline. First, I developed one strip normally with all 3 of my old concentrates again. After that, I decided to change only the pH, since if high pH was causing all my issues, I should be able to see some sort of difference. For this, I replaced just enough of the water in the developer with vinegar to bring down the pH to around 10.05, which was much closer to the target pH of 10. When I compared these 2 new strips, the pH adjusted one was maybe a little less dense, but not by much. And the individually inverted scans looked basically identical. So clearly pH could affect density a little, but it didn't change much this time. The real question was whether correcting the much larger pH gap on the hybrid strip could fix things. So for the next test, I used the same hybrid recipe from before, which used the dry CD4 powder instead of part C, and then I adjusted the pH with vinegar all the way down from 10.3 to 10.02. And this is what I got. Better, I guess. The reds aren't bright orange like before, but they're still not red. I was starting to run out of options here. All I could think of at this point was the only other ingredient listed on Part C's datasheet. Along with the CD4, there's a small amount of sodium metabisulfite, which I had left out as unimportant before. So I went on over to B&H and picked some up. I ended up adding 0.25 grams of it, and again I added vinegar to get the pH down to around 10. If the missing sulfite was the problem, this would be the fix. Nope, zero difference. Now I was really out of ideas. This should have worked. What did all the failed tests have in common? As far as I could tell, the only thing tying all the failed strips together was the CD4 itself. Everything that worked got the CD4 from somewhere else, either the lab or my part C. And even if I did chase some other tiny variable, I don't think it would matter. On the cursed strip, I pretty much intentionally screwed up all the chemistry. It had basically nothing in common with the hybrid strips except for the CD4, but it still had the same weird reds. Everything else about it came out relatively fine. The negatives were dense and scannable, and I probably could have corrected the color and white balance shifts if I tried. Plus, I weigh out dry CD3 all the time when I develop ECN2, so it's not like this is some new process to me. It must just be the CD4. Kind of ironic though, since that's the one thing I picked because it's supposed to last for years. When I'd first opened it, I noticed it was kind of clumpy and a bit more grayish than white, but I hadn't really thought too much of it. Plus, it did still develop the film, so I might still be wrong. Either way, the only way to really test this would be to source another batch of CD4 somehow. On Artcraft Chemicals, it just wasn't listed anymore. So I must have gotten the last batch of it, and nobody else seems to be selling it direct to consumer except for some Italian guy on eBay. So that's off the table. Either way, at the end of the day, all that really matters is making sure the chemistry I already know works can actually last. Even if I couldn't make the hybrid approach work, mixing normal developer from my 8-month-old concentrates gave me results that were still really close to the lab. If anything, it overdeveloped my film by a half stop or so, but that's a much better problem to have than chemistry I can't trust at all. And this isn't just me speculating. Just to see how much my chemistry degraded, I ordered a whole brand new 50-liter kit from Kodak and mixed up some fresh developer from it. That let me get this side by side. And besides maybe a little less saturation in the reds, I find it hard to see much of a difference at all. And outside a controlled test like this, I doubt anyone would be able to tell the difference. So much for only lasting 12 weeks. So basically the thing I tried to fix with dry CD4 was already mostly solved by just storing the concentrates well. The one last thing I wanted to see was if I could actually match the lab's density at home. And I had just the idea for how. So the developer I bought from Kodak isn't actually normal developer. As I mentioned before, it's developer replenisher, which is kind of like regular developer that's a little too strong. Normally, labs buy it so they can replenish the developer in their machines, since each time the developer is used, it loses a little bit of its juice. Part of how that juice is lost is through increased bromide. When the film is developed, part of what happens is that it releases more bromide into the developer, which acts as sort of a restrainer on development. That means a replenisher needs to have a bit less bromide than normal. The problem is that I'm not a lab. I'm just trying to use this stuff one shot. Kodak does sell an absurd amount of developer starter for $150, which you're supposed to mix with replenisher for a working tank. The only starter that's still for sale though is the LORR, or low replenishment rate version, which is only meant for the LORR developer, not what I have. Plus, even if I did get that, I'd need like 4 times as much replenisher to even mix it all. My guess is that Kodak decided that putting this replenisher in their smaller kits was close enough for most people, since they'd probably be reusing it anyway. If anything, it being a bit overactive at first would kind of be a benefit in that situation, since activity could drift a bit down with use. This is all getting a bit too complicated though. All that really matters is that there's probably not quite enough bromide in what I have to match a seasoned tank that a lab might have. Why not just add my own? So for this last strip, I added an extra 0.15 grams of potassium bromide to my 250 mils of fresh stock developer. And here's what I got. In my opinion, it's about as close to the lab as I could realistically expect. I can't even really tell a difference myself. The amount of bromide I added was kind of just my best attempt at matching what a lab might have, while still being enough to see a difference. And it looks like that's exactly what happened. So where does all this leave us? Was I able to reverse engineer C-41 to make my developer last forever? Well, not really, but kind of. I think it's safe to say my hybrid approach of replacing part C with dry CD4 was pretty much a flop. And even if it had worked, I don't think I could have recommended it anyway. I'm pretty sure I got the last batch of it a normal person in the US could even order. And while it's a lot less exciting, I did learn one important thing. I don't have to stop trusting my wine bad concentrates after 12 weeks anymore. At least in my setup, where I was able to get pretty much all the air out, they were still completely usable after 8 months. I bet they'd even be fine for up to a year, although I haven't tested that quite yet. So Here's what I'd recommend if you're like me and you want to get your film developing costs as low as possible while still keeping quality high. If you don't already have bleach and fixer, start off with a full 5-liter kit from Kodak, which gives you all the chemicals you need. This lets you get your system together and you can stretch the bleach and fixer way further than the developer. I go into more detail on how to do that in my ECN2 mixing video. After that, pick up the bulk box of Replenisher, which comes with 2 sets of concentrates that each mix up to 25 liters of working developer. Once you open any of those, pour it into the smallest wine bag that'll fit it and get all the air out. I'll put the bags I use in the description. Optionally, if you want to match a lab seasoned tank more closely, you can add an extra 11 to 15 grams of potassium bromide directly to the Part A bag before you seal it off. I added 11 grams personally, since I can always add a bit more if I want a bit less developer activity later. This applies to the smaller kits too. You would just divide those numbers by 5 for the 5-liter kit. Once you have all that, whenever you want to develop some film, you'll measure out the right amount of each and mix them with distilled water. For 250 milliliters, that comes out to this. Assuming 250 milliliters is enough for 1 roll of film, that works out to about 100 rolls, if you can use it all within a year or so. That's around 75 cents a roll. And even if you only do half that many rolls before it goes bad, that's still only like $1.50. And when factoring in the cost of the bleach and fixer, that brings us to around $1 per roll, best case, and like 2 to 3 if you don't use it all. Still way better than the 10 to 15 per roll you're probably paying at the lab. So yeah, ideally still test it before running some irreplaceable roll through it, but I stand by this process way more than before now. But before I wrap this up, there's one last result from my tests I feel like I have to share. Remember the cursed strip from earlier? The one where I replaced the CD3 in my ECN2 recipe with CD4? That made me wonder what would happen if I just used my normal ECN2 developer rather than mixing it wrong on purpose. So I ran one more strip through my standard ECN2 process, and this is what I got. Weirdly enough, it actually looks pretty good, just maybe a little underdeveloped compared to the lab. If anything though, the reds are stronger and the white balance is pretty much spot on. That said, this is a whole other rabbit hole, and this video has gone on long enough already, so I think I'll have to save that for another time. Anyway, that's all I have for right now. If you found any of this useful, feel free to hit like or subscribe, and leave a comment if you've ever tried messing with any of this stuff. I'd love to know what worked for you, or if there's some other way to do cheap C-41 at home. Either way, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.